So if I can briefly invite each of the panel to just briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll go on to the questions. Thank you. So could I might name people, actually, it might be the easiest way. Is Simon Bailey able to introduce himself briefly, and then I'll name people as we go along?
Stephen, good morning, and good morning, everyone. I'm Simon Bailey. I'm the ex-Chief Constable of Norfolk Constabulary, where I was the Chief for 8 years. And during those 8 years, I was also the National Police Chiefs Council lead for child abuse investigations. And I was also the Violence and Public Protection portfolio lead for 5 years.
Thanks, Simon. That's great. Can I welcome Alexandra or Alex Butler to introduce themselves?
Hello there, hi. So I'm Alex Butler. I'm the clinical lead and therapist in STARS. We are a sexual trauma service that work with children and young people aged 5 to 18 in Surrey.
Thanks, Alexandra. That's great. I'm not sure if Sadia is with us, is she? I'm guessing not. This is Professor Simon Hackett. Simon, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi everyone, I'm Simon Hackett. I work at Durham University and I focus quite a lot on child abuse and neglect across different forms, but particularly the question around harmful sexual behaviour involving children.
Thanks, Simon. That's great. Is Zak Masters with us, able to join in? Thanks, Zak.
Good morning, my name is Zak Masters. I'm part of ACT. ACT stands for Assessment Consultation Therapy. We're a Surrey-based specialist service that is part of Surrey Children's Services, and we offer assessment, consultation and post-intervention for young people who have been identified as displaying harmful sexualised behaviour.
Thanks, Zak. That's great. Can I invite Professor Kieran McCartan to introduce himself? Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm Professor McCartan. I'm based at the University of the West of England in Bristol. A lot of the work and research I do is around risk management, public protection, and the prevention of sexual abuse. And I was one of the two study leads for this project. The study that I led on focused on the survivors' experiences of sibling sexual abuse and the resulting support and being able to adapt and move on post abuse. Thanks.
Thanks, Kieran. And as if I planned it, but I didn't, Suzanne will be answering the first question. So very nice. I'm going to ask Suzanne to introduce herself.
Hi, good morning all. I'm Suzanne Taylor. I'm the Assistant Director for the Child Sexual Abuse Core Priority Programme across Barnardo's.
Thanks, Suzanne. That's great. And thanks to all the panellists for introductions. So we have a series of questions that will be put to one or two of the panel members, and then other panel members will be asked to come in and comment. I am keeping guard of the time because lunch at 12:15 is very important. We might slip by a few minutes, but I hope we can stick pretty much to that. So Suzanne, can I put the first question to you, which is, why do children sexually abuse their siblings? And some thoughts about early indicators and prevention would be helpful. Thank you.
I think what we've learned so far today, when we think about the why, this is an absolutely huge question. There's a couple of things I'm going to focus on in this answer, which is around the context and how complex that can be. So it's complex, varied, never straightforward, and there's very rarely, if ever, one reason why. So from our work at Barnardo's and from research in the field, I've come together with some factors that are present when children sexually harm. They're in no particular order, but we think it's important to look at children's sexual development is shaped by their environment. So that environment includes the society we live in, education, community, family, very prevalent today, but also the culture that they live in, the religion that they're brought up within that family. And another important impact of feature is around social media and pornography. I know that's also been mentioned earlier today. The impact of that on young people is significant. This is something we're seeing more and more in services where there's been childhood sexual abuse and sibling sexual abuse, that pornography, the use of features in that. We know children are viewing this at a much younger age. and more extreme images. What we know so far is this blurs the boundaries and distorts expectations in relationships and behaviours in those relationships. Children are viewing sort of more extreme material intentionally and unintentionally, and that's quite important. I think it's also been noted today about the lack of appropriate sex and relationships education that's age appropriate, and that's something we see in our cases and children's knowledge and understanding. And another really important factor we see in these children within our services is isolation from peer group and loneliness. And this can particularly be pertinent for children with those with additional needs. We know children are overrepresented in our services where they have sexually harmed, have disabilities or additional needs. And also we need to recognise within society, puberty is an incredibly challenging time for children. We're learning about sexuality, relationships, and I think that was mentioned earlier by Jane around sexuality, and the hormonal changes are difficult. As I said at the start, context is important. There are some factors that are also prevalent in families, but this doesn't mean that all families with these makeups where there'll be sexual harm, and that's really, really important to note. This is things we know from research and work are prevalent, that it isn't one equals the other, but we do see a lot of intergenerational abuse and trauma, including sexual abuse, physical abuse and neglect. Some of this can often lead to blurred and distorted boundaries within the family and how the family make up. And another feature which links quite closely to that really is around families in high stress, financial stress, domestic abuse, parental ill health, substance misuse. There are also things that have been mentioned by Carol earlier in some of the ways her abuser used that against her to keep the secret. And I think another thing is when those families can be in high stress, older siblings are often given caregiving responsibilities and babysitting responsibilities where that access is available. If you live with your sibling, they're there all of the time, so that access is continual. And I think we've also mentioned earlier in one of the presentation at the start of the day, power and control is often a feature in those relationships. Sexual abuse can be used to hurt or harm or as revenge, or for comfort in high stress families. As I said, it's complex. You know, there's no one reason, and not all children living in these families where these things happen will sexually abuse, and that's clear. I think when we talk around prevention, there is a lack of research, so we need more to really understand some of this. But what we do know from survivors and those working in the field are some of the things that they've been touched on by Jane and Carol, really, around raising the professional and societal awareness, talking about child sexual abuse in itself and the prevalence of this within families and between siblings is really, really important. And I think having that improving professional training and awareness. So it's professionals' responsibility to spot potential signs and indicators, ask those questions, and holding sexual harm in mind when they're working with some of these families. There's a couple of other things we feel would really be important around good quality sex and relationship education for all children, but children with additional needs that's age appropriate, and good quality family support to reduce some of those high stress situations for families where we know that can contribute to the lack of boundaries and supervision, and support parents where there is abuse or trauma to be able to recover from that and be able to parent and look after their children. I think it's a couple of other things really around child sexual abuse. Specialist services should be available to all children throughout the whole country, the whole of the UK, so that they can access that therapeutic support when it's needed. And I think there's something really important about us as professionals and adults really understanding the realities of children's lives and the potential harms that are there within the home, outside the home, and how the two meet.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Stephen.
Extremely thorough. In a very short space of time, which is very hard to do. I don't know if one of the panel, I'm not going to open right out, want to add anything or comment, or would it be okay to move on to the next question? And we've just lost Simon somewhere. Simon Bailey, that is, not Simon Hackett. Okay, I'm going to move on to inviting Simon to answer the next question, which will hopefully build on Suzanne's responses and tell us more about the continuum between normative, problematic and harmful sexual behaviour and how this continuum can best be applied by professionals. And I think there's a lot of conversation in the first part of the day around continuums. So it's really helpful to have you here, Simon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope people can see that. Thanks for asking me to be on the panel today and this interesting question about a continuum. I came up with the idea of a continuum of sexual behaviour in childhood when I was writing something in 2010. You can see it on the screen, I hope. First of all, to note, it's not a continuum of harmful sexual behaviour. It was meant and described as a continuum of sexual behaviour in childhood. Obviously, it includes a strand there which are kind of normative, developmentally accepted, healthy sexual behaviours, which we can debate. And therefore, those things are not right to call, in my view, harmful. So this really was an attempt to look at levels of behavior from those that extend from things that are healthy and normative to those that on the other end of a continuum which are highly abusive and violent. So this was a fairly anonymous book chapter. I had no idea when I kind of conceptualized this that this idea of a continuum would take hold as it's done. It wasn't meant to be a typology of young people. It wasn't meant to present a model of fixed behavioral categories of young people, but really I intended it as an illustration when we're talking about children and their sexual development and sexual behavior. It's an illustration of the sheer diversity of children's sexual behaviors. And I should add as well, it's not specific to sibling sexual behavior at all, but children's sexual behavior across the board. At the time, I was worried that in systems that are very much concerned with risk, we were often getting it wrong for children whose sexual behaviour was causing concern. And I observed cases where we under-responded to children and didn't take seriously their abusive sexual behaviour, but at other times we over-responded to children whose behaviour was at a lower level. Possibly we did that because level of anxiety we attach to sexual behaviour being expressed by children or young people means that often that we viewed any expression of sex or sexual behaviour in childhood through a particular lens of sexual abuse or violence. And of course, whilst it's important to recognise sexual abuse and sexual violence as such and name them as such and respond to them accordingly, in other cases, children's sexual behaviours are developmentally normative or at a much lower level than accepted definitions of abusive behaviour. And therefore, I reckoned, and I still reckon, that we need a way of understanding and responding to children and young people's sexual behaviours at differing levels of concern and risk. In other words, we need to act in a balanced way to what's being presented by a child or a group of children. Let me give a brief example which I think might illustrate it. I was recently talking to an organisation about some work they wanted doing on what they titled child-on-child sexual abuse. And they provided a list of what they deemed constituted child-on-child sexual abuse, indicating things like sexual assaults and coercive sexual acts towards others. But they also included on that list of examples of child-on-child sexual abuse young people who make sexual remarks, use sexual language, or tell sexual jokes. And these were being offered up as examples of what was meant by sexual abuse. Now, without downplaying the harmful nature of some sexual remarks, I thought they'd got their concept wrong. In other words, they lumped together, or in lumping together, any kind of sexual remark or use of sexual language into the term sexual abuse. They ran the risk of pathologizing or labeling most young people as sexual abusers. Do we really want to do that? Of course not. So I think we need to be able to identify and respond to behaviors across a continuum from those that are quite normative and healthy for children at their age and developmental stage, which of course by definition should be supported and encouraged, through to those behaviours that are developmentally and behaviourally not out of step, but where the context for the behaviour might be problematic, where the task might be to help those children find a safer context for the expression of these appropriate behaviours, through at the other end of the continuum to those behaviours that are clearly abusive or sexually violent, which should obviously by definition be stopped or protected against. So this continuum is meant to illustrate this. 3 points before I turn briefly to the question of sibling sexual abuse. First, I think it's important to recognise that even for an individual child, their sexual behaviour can occupy different parts of this continuum. In other words, a young person might be demonstrating lots of appropriate sexual behaviours and one example of a harmful sexual behaviour, or vice versa. And I think it's important to assess behaviour, each behaviour, not just define a whole child forever by the worst thing they've ever done sexually. Secondly, I think the notion of a continuum doesn't or isn't meant to imply that a child will inevitably progress through these levels from lower level behaviours to higher level behaviours. We know it doesn't work like that. Most children who express low level inappropriate behaviours, especially with guidance and correction, don't go on to perpetrate abuse and violence. It's not necessarily as an incremental scale as such. And thirdly, the continuum itself focuses primarily on behaviour, but sexual behaviour can't be understood outside of its context. And the context for the behaviour, as well as the dynamics, often determine whether something's inappropriate or abusive, for example. So this model wasn't specifically defined and designed to understand sibling sexual abuse. And of course that sibling sexual abuse occurs in a particular context. How should this be applied to cases of sibling sexual abuse was the final part of the question. And I think the answer to the question might be different how should the continuum be applied to cases of sibling sexual behaviour as opposed to sibling sexual abuse? So abusive sexual behaviour between siblings is abuse, and I think it should be seen as on this continuum as abuse, and it should be assessed and responded to in the context of abusive and violent behaviour as suggested on this continuum, with particular care to understand the dynamics of the behaviour. I guess also there may be that there are some cases of sibling sexual behaviour that might be problematic but exist at a slightly lower level on this model. So for instance, sexual play in very young siblings might be examples that are often cited as inappropriate or problematic behaviours, but not necessarily hit the definition of abuse. I should stress, though, that very great care should be taken, as I've tried to emphasise, to understand the nature of any behaviour, the true dynamics involved, the context in which these behaviours occur, and therefore the level of response needed to be commensurate with the behaviours being expressed. And I think this applies as much to siblings as any other form of childhood sexual behaviour. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. Once again, presented very succinctly, very helpful, and I've seen some postings on the chat about how helpful the tool is, both in school settings, but also with families and so forth, but also the complexity and nuance is sometimes difficult, and we need to weigh all of that up. Just wondering if any other panel want to pass any comments or thoughts about the tool, the continuum, whether they've had experience of using it in their context. Thank you. Simon Bailey, you look like you were going to come in there. Was that not the case?
No, Stephen, it was. Forgive me. I was just making sure my technology was behaving. So, look, Simon, that's the first time I have seen that, and I have to say, I think that could be incredibly useful. And certainly from this, what I will do is I'll make sure that's taken back into policing and disseminated amongst those child protection officers that are investigating these crimes when they do that, because I think it could be incredibly helpful in terms of defining the investigative approach that officers will take, because what you've very, very neatly done is broken it down into some specific areas. And yes, I would recognise that you could have offenders and abusers moving across the continuum, but actually to be able to look at an investigation through that lens, I think could be really very, very helpful indeed.
Thanks, Simon. Very happy to work with you on that.
Thank you.
That's a really helpful link that's just come out of this conversation, because those of us in the field think everybody knows about the continuum, particularly in the UK. But so that's really interesting to note that we shouldn't make assumptions, or I shouldn't. I'm going to move on to the next question, if that's okay, and that's for Zak and Alex. And thanks very much, Simon, or both Simons. It's really helpful. It's rather a wordy question. I hope I don't get too tongue-tied. I know you've had the question beforehand, thankfully, so you've had some time to prepare. And the question is, does the sex of the child harmed and the sex of the child who is harmed, I even need to read it, is that complicated? So in other words, whether a brother is abusing a brother or a sister abusing a brother or a sister, hope you can keep with me here, affect how they both receive professional support. There is a second part to the question, but I might just start with that first part.
If I start to answer that, Stephen, in answer, we work with the young children who have been identified as displaying harmful sexualised behaviour. And in answer to the question put forward, the simple answer is no. At ACT, we complete an assessment that's called the AIM3 assessment, which is a specific assessment for children that have displayed harmful sexualised behaviour. It's a framework for assessing young people who've identified as displaying harmful sexualised behaviour. What I like about the AIM3, it is a holistic approach that involves looking at each area of the young person's life. It's not just focusing on the sexualised behaviour. And as Simon said, it's not defining the young person by what they've done sexually. We're looking at the young person as a whole. It enables us as practitioners to identify underlying causes and triggers and the young person's unmet core needs. So whether the young person is male or female, when a young person is referred to ACT, we complete an AIM3 assessment and offer ongoing post-intervention support based on the needs identified during that assessment. Going back to what Anna said during her presentation, we need to remember foremost that children who are sexually harmed or display harmful sexualised behaviour are first and foremost children. A high percentage of children that are referred to ACT have experienced their own form of abuse or trauma. So as practitioners, when offering support, we make sure the intervention is child-led and balanced, holding the young person accountable for their actions, but on the other hand, being sensitive to their own past experiences and unmet needs.
Thanks, Zak. I'll ask Alex to come in. Alex, can you also think about whether the sex, gender of the child who's harmed and those who have harmed, how that might affect the response that they get?
Yeah, certainly. I think, so in STARS, we're working with any young person that's experienced sexual trauma. And so we have referrals for both boys and girls, and we've increasingly had referrals for sibling abuse. And for us, it's fair to say that there is no difference whether or not the young person referred is male or female, or whether or not they've experienced abuse from a male or female. It's very much tailored to the individual, so it's what that individual child needs. And the same would go for whether or not that was, there were SEN needs to be considered or anything else. It's really about that young person and making sure that they get what they need. I think for us, it's really important to take into consideration the wider system. It's thinking systemically. So that means looking at how the rest of the family have been impacted by what's happened, whether that's siblings, parents, the wider system, pulling them into the work, making sure they get the support as well. Obviously working kind of multi-agency, we work lots with ACT and we share cases together. So for us and our approach, our therapeutic approach, that there is no difference.
Thanks, Alex. the question goes on to ask, is there a wider impact for family and social impact on children and later as adults when we consider there may be different responses based on the sex or the gender of the child? Does anybody would either of you like to comment on that?
I think the immediate impact on the family as a whole is devastating. Stuart summed it up perfectly this morning, describing it as a grenade going off in the family. There's pretty much what was said earlier. There's lots of disbelief, some denial, self-blame, and a lot of secrecy goes in. The impact it's having on families I'm working with a young boy now who's been removed from the family home. Which is, as there's no extended family for him to go to, Dad's had to move out with him as well. And there's that secrecy that Mum and Dad are talking about, that they can't tell friends or extended family what's going on. So friends automatically assume that there's a problem in their relationship, but because they're trying to protect both children and they don't want extended family or friends to know what's going on, they're keeping it very secret, and that's having a big impact on their relationships with people outside the family home. And then you've got to consider external agencies all of a sudden going into their family. And this is a family that to them had the perfect family, and all of a sudden children's services are becoming involved, police, and the child's going on child protection register, and they're feeling out of control of their own family unit. Yeah. I don't know if you want to extend on that, Alex.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, because obviously this is a case that Zak and I are working on together. And I think for us as well, sort of when you were saying then about that kind of the wider context, and for this family, very much that's the social context is really important for them. And the young person who was harmed has shared her experiences with members of the community. And actually the impact on them has been great. And so we've been offering therapy to those young people that have heard the story as well, because it's just, the kind of the ripple effect of it going out across is huge, and it's really important to be able to support everybody that's impacted by what's happened.
Thanks, Zak and Alex. Just to say, AIM 3, for those who don't know, because it's an international audience, is an assessment framework for adolescents who have harmed sexually, and it balances strength and concern factors, in short. And SEN stands for special educational needs, because I can't assume that the international audience will know some of that language. Any brief comments from any of the panel before I move on to the next question, which is for Simon Bailey? Okay, so thanks very much, Zak and Alex.
Thank you
for your thoughts on that question. And I've noticed there's still lots of chat going on in the background, which I think is great, because that's what we want to stimulate: conversation, connections, thoughtfulness. Simon, question for you. Is sibling sexual abuse commonly reported to the police, and how is it approached when it is reported?
So, Stephen, can I just thank you for asking me to join today's conference? And before I answer the question, can I just say thank you to Jane and Carol and Terry that's made mention in the chat. I have listened to so many victims, and there is never ever occasion when it doesn't have an impact. And again, Jane, Carol, your openness, your honesty, look, is palpable. So just thank you for sharing with us. It takes huge courage to do that. And I'm acutely aware now, as a former police officer of 35 years and somebody that cares passionately about policing, I always took the perspective that as the national lead, I couldn't do anything about the damage that had been done. And on occasions, I couldn't do anything about the failings of the service other than to say sorry. But what I set out to do was to drive fundamental change in the police service's response to all forms of child sexual abuse. And whilst we don't get it right every time, and I'm acutely aware of the independent inquiry yesterday and their very critical report of the police service's response, I have to look forward with a sense of optimism that actually we are getting better. And a critical point has been something that I've championed and driven around the importance of victims being believed. And I think we have now got past that point where there is no longer a debate around whether victims should be believed or not. Victims are now routinely being believed quite rightly. I've made the point very powerfully that belief is the construct of the abuser, and it's not the construct of the victim and actually, or the survivor. And actually, I think we are now in a position whereby we've met that challenge head on, despite the huge amount of media criticism, and are now in a far stronger place. And most of the time, we get it right. Now, to go to that specific point, when I took over the responsibility for child protection back in 2014, familial abuse made up in the region of 80% of all the reports of child sexual abuse, overwhelmingly the greatest percentage. That has now shifted in the last 4 years, and I don't think it's because there is less of it. And Lucy put a question into lockdown: do we think there's more abuse taking place during lockdown? I can't help but think, Lucy, that there has, and it'll be a matter of time before we truly understand what increase there has been, if there has been one. But my professional instinct and what I'm seeing from an online threat would certainly indicate that. But as it stands today, familial abuse will account for in the region of 60, maybe 63% of all child sexual abuse. So still the greatest percentage. And I think the sibling sexual abuse within that will make up a significant percentage of it. I don't think there is any doubt in my mind. And I'm obviously aware of the research that colleagues hosting this conference and joining this conference today are running. I will wait to see the outcome of that study with interest, but I can't help but think that it will make up a significant percentage. And in terms of how the police service is dealing with that, of course, every single case will be dealt with on the basis of what's presented by the officers, and no two cases will ever be the same. I think we have to recognise that, and ultimately we have to have the confidence, and we have to make sure that the officers that are dealing with these incredibly complex cases, difficult cases, are the best equipped and the most educated in terms of how they are able to deal with the abuse that's being reported to them. On some occasions, it will lead to a criminal justice outcome. In other cases, it simply won't, because the age of criminal responsibility has not been reached. So we would all recognise just how complex this is. I cannot overstate the importance of ISVAs in this, and intermediaries on occasions as well. And I think that is a critical element of it. And of course, we continue to learn all the time around how we can improve our response and how we can try and get this better. And actually, as I said at the start, I've got to be positive in that I'm no longer a police officer. My second career, if you like, is absolutely around trying to improve the response to safeguarding, the response to investigations of sexual abuse. And where we can learn, we will learn. Where we will apologise, we will apologise. But ultimately, so much good work goes on every single day, and I just fear that there is a disproportionate focus on where it's gone wrong, which undermines the brilliant work that is taking place so frequently. As I said, it is every single day that's taking place. So, Stephen, I hope I've answered the question directly. It's difficult to give the stats because, of course, we're waiting for the research, but I don't think there's any question that it will make up a significant percentage of the familial abuse that is reported. But I also hope that I've been able to provide some of the context of what police officers are doing every day, the approach that they are taking, but also recognising just how difficult the current environment is. Some of the criticisms that we've had are justified. And as I said, I have said sorry on a number of occasions, but that shouldn't be to the detriment, and it shouldn't be to the misgivings of some brilliant colleagues that are doing wonderful work every single day supporting victims of this awful crime.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks for your honest comments. And I mean, there's a lot being posted, conversations about, and in a way, some mistrust of police, as it won't be surprising to you. But also highlighting the work that you do, and that often doesn't get seen. And we all have a role to play. It's multi-agency. We all need to be thoughtful in this, but also people are harmed by responses from agencies that aren't kind or thoughtful, and we know, and the process of criminalisation is not always the best approach, actually, and it's very complex. You mentioned, as far as I'm just aware of, the Lighthouse project. I don't know if that's the right description, in London. Has some very innovative ways of working with child sexual abuse and linking with the judiciary. And I think, for me, I liken it to the child advocacy models in the US, but there are other, there is another word that slightly, the descriptions, Kieran may remember the name of the European-based project that it's based on, slips my mind at the moment. Any comments from panelists? Very, very quiet panel. Lots of conversation, lots to take on.
I think, Stephen, I think you're, I think it's the Barner House model.
Thank you. It is Barnett House. It had slipped my mind for a minute. My head gets too full sometimes. So thank you. That's really helpful, Simon. So they're really innovative projects to work with child sexual abuse. And I had the privilege, Karen was at that conference on sexual violence in Bristol not too long ago, where they presented some very powerful work around how they engage with children, with young people, and how they were getting magistrates and judiciary on board with these packs where the magistrates were using those packs of, I'm trying to describe it, fiddle toys, a whole range of things that they could use just to engage the young person in a safer conversation. So there's some amazing innovation out there. Thank you, Simon, for your time. I really appreciate it. I'm now going to pass on to Karen. The question is, Karen, how can professionals recognise the signs of sibling sexual abuse in adults who were abused as children, and how can they help to enable disclosure? And I also think about support, actually.
Thanks, Stephen. One of the main challenges and issues around this is the nuance. And what we heard from a lot of the victim survivors who participated in the research was this idea that actually when they went and when they talked about sibling sexual abuse, it was often framed and seen as child sexual abuse or an extension of child sexual abuse, where a lot of the victims saw it and felt it as being something distinct and something different, and felt that they needed support around the distinctiveness of it. And quite often the research that we did pointed out that it was about aligning already existing services to shoehorn in sibling sexual abuse as a way of responding or dealing with it, rather than looking at the unique individual nature of it. One of the real challenges around sibling sexual abuse, more so than some other forms of abuse, is it's about the context. Quite often, unfortunately, in this country, we look at abuse in terms of the action, in terms of the offence, in terms of what's happened. But actually, all sexual abuse exists within a context, and sibling sexual abuse exists within a family context. So it's about looking at the socio-ecological system that surrounds the child and surrounds the abuse that's taken place. So them as an individual, their relationship with the person who is abusing them, the broader relationship with the family system and the family dynamic, and the broader system with the community, and how these all tie together. In terms of childhood and victims coming forward in childhood, a lot of the victims that we spoke to felt that either they couldn't come forward in childhood, or if they did, there were issues that presented legitimate problems with them. So some of the cases that we have already heard today about family separation, we also heard stories of parents choosing one sibling over another and engaging with that about saving face and saving value. There was also conversations that came out of victim narratives about parents who knew but didn't want to get engaged, and parents who didn't know but didn't want to ask the question. They knew there was something wrong, but they didn't want to get involved. And then there was also stories and narratives about when the reporting happened and they went to professional services, that people were separated, that they were talked to differently. And a lot of the victim survivors came back and talked about actually the abuse happened within a system. So therefore, we all need to be involved in stopping the abuse and recognizing it. The other thing that becomes really important in this is the family dynamic within it. And a lot of the victims talked about ongoing abuse within the family. So it wasn't so much that, going back to some of the earlier comments, that if you were a victim, you'll go on to be a perpetrator. There was conversations about how maybe the sibling who had abused them had maybe suffered neglect or suffered abuse, that there was other things going on within the context of the family. And one of the really important and interesting statements that was made was that the dysfunctionality of the family system made the sibling sexual abuse seem functional. And this certainly relates to some of the issues and challenges that we have already debated. So when children report or young adults report, and it's about a family system or a family member, it's about looking at that whole complex situation. The other thing that they often talked about was access to services and how long things took. That, a lot of them wanted support and they wanted help. It wasn't necessarily always a criminal justice response. They wanted their sibling to stop abusing them, but then got embroiled in a criminal justice approach, which could take months or even years. And then there's just two last things that I want to focus on. Something else came out of the research that we didn't expect to find, which I think is important for professionals. So when sort of Stephen had sort of indicated that maybe we have some prejudices around this, that when we talk about familial abuse, we think about parents abusing children, or we think about adults abusing children. There was a significant number of the victims that we talked to who talked about female siblings and participating in abuse, which was not necessarily something that we went looking for, but it was interesting to discover. So it's actually, broadening our minds beyond that it's a male sibling sexually abusing either another male sibling or a female sibling. There can be sexual abuse by female siblings towards male and female siblings. And then the last big one is training around understanding, training around the role of trauma, training around how siblings interact with each other and how they interact within a family system, and what is the best type of therapeutic approach to take within that context. A lot of this for professionals really goes back to, therapy and risk management 101. We're talking about what works here. We're not talking about a blanket approach. That takes time and that takes consideration. That takes appropriate risk assessment tools, some professional insights that are able to help with that. But my strong advice would be to go back to the core question, Stephen. What advice for professionals? Ask the questions, take the time, don't be judgmental, and don't go in with expectations around what you hope or want or fear to find, but always listen to the child. And we've got to remember, being a parent of an 11-year-old myself, the answers that we get from children aren't always straightforward, don't always make sense. And actually, that's really important when we think about the limited time the professionals have to deal with some of these issues. Let's not rush in to making decisions. Let's take time and consider the nuance. So hopefully that gives some sort of answer to the question.